how organisms get their energy. Yesterday we talked about this stuff and we mentioned it briefly, or we actually talked about the first little section. We talked about autotrophs and producers being the same thing, right? Autotrophs and producers are the same thing. We talked about heterotrophs and consumers being the same thing. And then we talked about how all of these things, herbivores, carnivores, omnivores, decomposers, those are all different types of consumers, okay, as well as a scavenger. It was a different type of consumer. Now, I did briefly mention yesterday a food chain and a food web, but I said I was going to leave that pretty much to today. So this is what we're going to focus on today, is focus on the food chain, food web. What is a trophic level, primary, consumer, secondary, and tertiary? Okay, let's go ahead and jump into that. We'll scroll on down to where that was. All right, now, how do we show the flow of energy in an ecosystem or in a food web? Well, there's two ways you can actually do it. Okay, there's two ways you can show that flow. You can show that flow with a food chain, or you can show that flow with a food web. They're two totally different types of devices that we use to show the flow of energy in an ecosystem. Now, a food chain is very simple. Food web is very complex. A food chain is a very unrealistic model, and that's because it only shows one organism in each step. Like this last step, it shows a bear or a polar bear eating a fish. Well, yeah, that's true. A polar bear probably does eat a fish, but that's not the only thing that it consumes. That's not the only thing it gets its energy from. It could probably eat a baby seal. It could eat a baby Arctic fox. It could eat anything, right, in that environment. So a food chain is kind of unrealistic because it only shows one organism being consumed by another. A more realistic model would actually be a food web. What it is it is a series of interconnected food chains, and it looks a lot more complex. Even though it looks more complex, it's not more complex. Just to show you a food chain, this was a food chain, right? Nice and simple. This is a food web, obviously a little bit more complex, and you can see it is many food chains that have been put together, okay? So let's go up to a food chain. Let's go back to a food chain. Now, a food chain, it does go from the top, from the sun to all top-level consumers. Just like what you saw right here, it goes from the sun all the way to top-level consumers. And it usually only has 3 or 4 transfers of energy. Now, this is an important part right here. It usually will only have 3 or 4 transfers of nutrients or energy. And that is because energy transfer is very inefficient. What that means is that every time energy is transferred from one organism to the other, only 10% of that energy is transferred. 90% of that energy is actually lost in the form of heat or metabolism. Make sure you remember this because this is on the EOC. Every time energy is transferred, right, 90% is lost in the form of heat, and only 10% is transferred. Now, each step in a food chain is called a trophic level. Every step in a food chain is called a trophic level. In other words, you have 1 organism, 2 organisms, 3 organisms, 4 organisms, and 5. So in this food chain, grass energy is transferred to the grasshopper. The grasshopper's energy is transferred to the frog, et cetera, et cetera. What this means is basically grass is eaten by a grasshopper, grasshopper is eaten by a frog, frog is eaten by a snake, and every time the other one, it gains that organism's energy. But in this, since there's 5 levels, there would be 5 trophic levels. Each one of these organisms would represent a trophic level. And keep in mind that the arrow will typically point in the direction of the flow of energy, and it will point towards the organism that actually is consuming the other one. So in this case, the grasshopper is consuming that grass, or grass is being consumed by that grasshopper. All right, so that's how you read a food chain. Nice and easy, nothing too complex. We can go back to that food chain I used yesterday. right? At the end of the day, all the ultimate source of energy comes from the sun. Well, that sun is, that radiant energy is converted into a chemical energy by this autotroph or producer. This producer is producing its own glucose by the process of photosynthesis. That's why it's called a producer or an autotroph. Now, in the next step, all of these things would be considered to be consumers, right? Also known as heterotrophs. Now, there's differentiations between them, and it's based off how far away they are from the producer. The first thing to eat, right, is going to be called a primary consumer. The second thing that eats is going to be called a secondary consumer. And the third thing that eats will be called a tertiary consumer. All right, so it's fairly simple. Now, your entire food web thing, as we've mentioned before, food webs are obviously, let's see if this will work. Food webs are much more realistic. There is more than one organism in most of these trophic levels. So in other words, there's more than one primary consumer. There's more than one secondary consumer. It is a series of interconnected food chains. And here are some things that you have to be able to do on the EOC. You have to be able to identify an organism's trophic level, and you simply do so by counting from the producer level, just like what we did right here, right? We count from the producer level. That means this would be a primary consumer, secondary, tertiary. Okay. Now let's scroll down, take a look at this food web. All right, I'm going to show y'all how this thing works and how to be able to answer these last two questions. Now, the first thing you would want to be able to do on this food web, just say for an example, can we identify all of the autotrophs? All right, well, that should be easy because I know an autotroph is a grass or a plant or something like that. So can I identify all of the autotrophs? It's fairly easy. If I look at this food web, I see traditionally the autotrophs and producers are down at the bottom. I have the corn, right? I have this flowering plant, which is right there. I have lavender. And then I have these mangoes. And since mangoes grow from a tree, they are typically going to be considered to be an autotroph or a producer. So that's nice and easy. All right, now next up on our list, can I identify the primary consumers? Well, the way you identify a primary consumer is you just simply count from the producers or from the autotrophs. You count to see what is the first thing that eats. So the first thing that eats corn is a grasshopper. The first thing that eats lavenders in these plants is a butterfly. And then the first thing that eats these mangoes, right, is a fruit fly. So all of these three things would be considered to be primary consumers. Even more easy, guys. The next thing up would be a secondary consumer. You literally just count in the food chain. So I'm going to start, if I go this food chain, right, corn is eaten by a grasshopper, grasshopper is eaten by a rat. If I go in that food chain, the rat would be a secondary consumer. If I go this food chain, grass is eaten by a grasshopper, grasshopper is eaten by a frog would be a secondary consumer. Same thing here, plants to butterfly to dragonfly. That means a dragonfly would be a secondary consumer. And then if I go mangoes to fruit fly to thrush, a thrush would be a secondary consumer. Now here's where things get tricky, so make sure you're paying attention. All right, if I did look for tertiary consumers, tertiary consumer means it would be the third thing that eats, right? So corn, grasshopper, that's primary, secondary, python would be tertiary. Corn, grasshopper, frog, python, it's still tertiary. Matter of fact, I could go corn, grasshopper, rat, wolf. Wolf would be tertiary, okay? Here's where it gets tricky. If I go mangoes, primary, secondary, following fruit fly to dragonfly, that's secondary. this thrush could also be a part of a different trophic level. And that's where you see a little bit of a difference, okay? That's where you see a little bit of a difference. You'll get a question that'll say, can an organism belong to more than one trophic level? Well, you see this thrush, it's part of the tertiary consumer level as well as part of the secondary consumer level. So could you have an organism belong to more than one level? The answer to that is yes. Now, this part's simple. Can more than one organism belong to the same trophic level? Well, just FYI, you have a rat, a frog, a dragonfly, and a thrush. That's 4 organisms that all belong to the secondary consumer trophic level. So the answer to this question is yes as well. All right. Now, I'm not going to go through the rest of these, but you can see how, the most important thing is that you start by identifying the autotrophs, and then you just start to count from there and make sure you follow each of the individual food chains as you're counting. Because sometimes you will end up with an organism that's part of more than one trophic level, and you obviously have more than one organism at each trophic level. I know that's a mouthful of words there, but if you don't understand it, go back and play this lecture sometime on your own time and at your own speed, and maybe it'll start to click with you. All right. Now that's pretty much all of this set of PowerPoint notes for today.